if you take the global situation, and this is the first page on your notes, these are I've given you there the figures from the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization, which produces an annual report on fisheries stocks. And that reveals that 7% of the world's stocks at the moment are being underfished. 60% are being fished to what would be regarded as their maximum sustainable yield. So if you go beyond that, then they will become overfished and the breeding stock would start to be damaged. And 33% are in fact being overfished at the present time. And if you go back to 1974, the figure of the stocks being overfished was 10%, whereas now it's 33%.
Where I would imagine that the increase in fishing pressure comes from largely unregulated fishing economies.
Yes,
So,
now what do you call unregulated fishing?
Like Asia probably, and India.
Yeah, the knowledge of these things, unregulated fishing is by definition...
Regulated but no sort of oversight.
Yeah, there's very little administration of the fisheries industry.
Yeah, so if it's happening in those areas, then surely the answer is, well, it's just to effectively regulate those fisheries.
Right, protect and regulate. So I'm going to put a very difficult question to you. How do you do that?
Well, I mean, to a large extent you can't, I suppose. But then, those countries had ought to probably start looking at regulating their fish in order to maintain their stocks. And it said in the video that you've got big Western trawler companies coming and trawling off their coasts. But are they fishing unsustainably? I mean, I'm sure they're not helping, but what is the source of the unsustainable fishing? Is that actually from these very small boats, or is it from the big super trawlers?
Well, it depends which part of the world you're talking about.
Like in Asia.
Yeah. Well, in Asia, I mean, the first thing to remember is that you've got a fisheries zone which goes out to 200 nautical miles, which is known as the exclusive economic zone, which belongs to the coastal country. So the sea bordering a coastal country has an exclusive economic zone where the fisheries are in the ownership, so to speak, of that country. Beyond that figure, out into the ocean, you've got what is known as the high seas, where there is no ownership. It's common ground. The stock is commonly owned by the world as a whole. And so you've got two different sets of circumstances. Now, if you take European fisheries, they're being managed out to the 200 nautical mile limit. Once you go beyond that, they're into the high seas and anyone can fish them. Now, in other parts of the world, if you want to keep other countries out of your exclusive economic zone, a lot depends on the capacity of your government to actually bring that into effect. And as we saw in the film Has Fish Had Its Chips, the EU, because it has overfished in our waters, has actually negotiated agreements with a lot of countries, particularly in West Africa at the present time, to go and fish their exclusive economic zone. So they've actually come in, formed trading fishing arrangements with those countries, and then bring them back, the fish caught back to Europe and sell into the European market. So it's a pretty complex state of affairs, which really has no governmental regulation in many parts of the seas. And this is one of the issues that has to be addressed, because otherwise fishing, overfishing, will go on, and the idea of being able to sustainably fish will be a dream. And that's the fear that underlines our film.
But where is most of this increase in unsustainable fisheries? Is it in Asia? Is that where the increase in unsustainable fishing is happening? You've mentioned in the 70s it was 10% above maximum.
Well, if you go to the United Nations Food and Agricultural 2050 report, and you Google it, you can see their report from every sector of the ocean all around the world. And they provide an assessment of the degree to which the stocks in that part of the world are fished sustainably or otherwise. And I've cited for you at the bottom of that page examples of the stocks that are overfished, and they're the Mediterranean, the Southeast Pacific, and the Southwest Atlantic. And based on the 2015 figures, you've got 60% of the stocks in those parts of the world's oceans being overfished. Whereas in other parts of the Pacific, only 15% of the stocks are being overfished and fished. It's a very variable pattern. You don't want to be too categoric when you make these statements, because it varies. The way cod is being fished at the moment, and you saw the impact that it's had on the North Sea stock, which 5 years had to be closed completely because it was on the brink of extinction. And so they had to take drastic measures under the Common Fisheries Policy, and there was no fishing of that stock for 3 or 4 years, I think it was. What had been going on there, and still goes on even now, is the method of fishing. And that is primarily related to the size of the net that they use. For a fish stock to rebound, it's got to be able to reproduce successfully. As same with any species, it's almost too obvious to state, but it's true. It's the fundamental point. And a cod can live to the age of about 25, in which case you end up with a very, very large fish. And sometimes you see photographs of cod of that size. Now, cod becomes sexually mature at around the age of 3. And will start, if you take the female, it will start laying eggs at that age, and it will lay, in a year, about 250,000 eggs. Now, every time a cod increases its weight by around 1 kilogram, so it doubles, basically, its ability to produce eggs. Which means that the older the cod that you have in your stock, the more fecund, in terms of its ability to produce eggs, is that fish. So what you need in a stock is older fish, because they are the ones producing the most eggs, and therefore maximizing the reproductive potential of that stock. And if you take a cod of around the age of 8 years, compared to one of 3 years, which is producing 250,000 eggs, an 8-year-old is producing about 2.5 million eggs. And that increase will go on as the fish grows older and older. So in order to rebuild those stocks that we saw, you've got to have older fish in the stock. Now, out of 1 million eggs that are laid each year, only 2 need to survive to adulthood. for that stock to be able to reproduce successfully. So all the remaining 999,000 eggs are food within the marine food ecosystem, the food chain. So they too are actually serving a very vital purpose to other creatures. So having a large stock of fish is beneficial in that sense as well. Now, what happens with the nets is that they are of a size that once a cod reaches 5 years of age, it's too big to get through the net. So any fish, any codfish that is older than 5 years, which happens to be trapped in a net, is pulled out of the sea. And when you repeat that year after year, as they have been doing, you end up with a breeding stock where the oldest adult in that stock is just 5 years old. And all the potential and older fish are eliminated from that stock. And so its capacity to reproduce is suppressed. And so net size is absolutely fundamental in terms of how you manage a fishery. And the same principle applies to other species of fish and the way they're fished. So if you want to increase the spawning stock, you've actually got to increase the mesh size of that net. And that is one of the primary reforms that needs to take place. And you say to yourself, right, we're going to let fish, cod in this instance, get through the net until it's the age of 8, 10, whatever figure you want to set. And that way you actually end up rebuilding the stock. The difficulty in that, and it's not happened, it didn't happen in the Commons Fisheries Reform, is that you end up having effectively closing that fishery for 5 years. So if you set the net size at 8 years and they're catching them at 3, you're closing it for 3 years. If you're setting it at 10, you're closing it for 5 years. So the fishing industry takes a hit. It's unable to catch that particular species for that period of time. And that would happen then on the expectation of a reinvigorated industry once you reopen it. But at the present time, that kind of thinking, no one has been prepared to bite that kind of bullet. And that kind of reform is still off the table. But it's where we have to go if we are to get the fish stocks back to anything near historic levels,